The intelligence was very inconclusive. The intelligence says we don't know. It could have been very severe. That's what the intelligence says. So I guess that's correct. But I think we can take the we don't know. It was very severe. It was obliteration. And you'd think that a media outlet would say, isn't that a great thing?
We have the hour to sift through whatever he was trying to say there. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East, 4 days after dramatic military action in Iran. Do you know where your Secretary of Defense is? What he's doing? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we evaluate what Donald Trump just said or tried to say, practically in the same incoherent breath, admitting the preliminary U.S. intelligence of the damage done in the wake of the U.S. strike on Iranian nuclear facilities was, in Trump's telling, quote, very inconclusive, end quote, but that Donald Trump also believes that same, quote, very inconclusive intelligence somehow proves, quote, obliteration. That muddled statement came after leaked documents. A leaked internal assessment reportedly suggested that the U.S. strikes weren't as successful as Donald Trump originally claimed they were. Now, an alarming Axios piece of reporting says the Trump administration's response to all of this is to limit the classified information that it shares with Congress moving forward. That's according to 4 administration sources who say this, quote, federal officials are planning to limit posting on CapNet, a system the administration uses to share classified information with Congress. The DIA, that's the Defense Intelligence Agency's assessment on the Iran bombings, was put on CapNet late Monday. Quote, go figure. Almost as soon as we put the information on CapNet, it leaks, an administration source said. There's no reason to do this again. Which brings us back to the question we proposed. What's the Secretary of Defense up to today? If you guessed launching a leak investigation, well, come on down, because former Fox News host Pete Hegseth, who once accidentally shared sensitive information with a journalist who was added to a Signal chat, is on the job. The Pentagon's focus now apparently includes a criminal investigation seeking answers to how journalists got their hands on classified damage assessments that suggest U.S. airstrikes may not have set Iran's nuclear program back as significantly as the administration has communicated it did. Today at the NATO summit in the Netherlands, Hegseth lashed out at the media again for using the government's own analysis to question whether or not the attack was effective, and in so doing may have confirmed the leak he's now charged with investigating. Watch.
They don't care what the troops think. They don't care what the world thinks. They want to spin it to try to make him look bad based on a leak. Of course, we've all seen plenty of leakers. And what do leakers do? They have agendas. And what do? Do they share the whole information or just the part that they want to introduce? And when they introduce that preliminary, a preliminary report that's deemed to be a low assessment. You know what a low assessment means? Low confidence in the data in that report. And why is there low confidence? Because all of the evidence of what was just bombed by 12 30,000-pound bombs is buried under a mountain, devastated and obliterated. So if you want to make an assessment of what happened at Fordo, you better get a big shovel and go really deep, because Iran's nuclear program is obliterated.
All of this is where we start the hour with Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator, I've been following your sort of real-time commentary, but let's just start unpacking Hegseth. There's something disturbing about watching him perform with Donald Trump over his shoulder. We'll just start by trying to ascertain the facts. He did seem to confirm the DIA assessment, though, there, didn't he?
Well, they've all essentially confirmed the DIA assessment. And listen, the one thing that he's right about is that, you know, there is always going to be low confidence in assessing a strike in a foreign country designed to destroy something underground. We don't have cameras underneath there. We don't know exactly what we hit or what we didn't hit. But the initial assessment of DIA, of the photographic evidence, is that they did not fundamentally destroy those assets. And what we also know is that the Iranians were successful in moving moving a lot of the enriched uranium out of Fordo. And that maybe is the most important fact. If we didn't destroy the 60% enriched uranium, they frankly don't need that many centrifuges in order to continue to enrich up to nuclear grade. So listen, they're mad, they're furious. You can see it in their voice because they got caught in a lie. They got caught in a lie. They went out there and said that that the nuclear capacity of Iran was obliterated, that we'd set back the program at least a year. They knew they were lying when they said it. They got caught in the lie. That's super embarrassing. And they're trying to cover up that lie with this righteous indignation, blaming everybody but themselves for the fact that they did the really unforgivable sin of national security communication. They fudged intelligence about our national security. You can't do that because, as we have seen over and over again over the course of our history, that's what gets us into unnecessary wars of choice. That's what gets not dozens or hundreds of Americans killed, but thousands of Americans killed. They're angry because they got caught lying this weekend.
I have been to that movie, and I do know how it ends. Tell me why you think this is happening, because when you look at what Donald Trump could have said, he could have said the military performed brilliantly, they successfully struck their targets, and his base would have been just as happy. Why do you think they're digging in and doubling and tripling down on this word obliterated, which, by the way, his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs did not agree with on Sunday morning?
Yeah, listen, what you said is right. The military did their job here. But one of the reasons we have been reluctant to use a overhead strike is that we, the American national security community, has known that there was a medium to low probability that we would do the kind of damage that we wanted, but that there would be then, because of the strike inside Iran, the potential for regional conflict, the potential for a lot of Americans to get killed, the potential for diplomacy as an option to disappear, as it has, at least in the short run. So the military did their job. They should be applauded for a really dangerous mission. But it's not their fault that the mission they were given had a low likelihood of success, and the standard that Donald Trump set, obliteration, was a standard that the military probably was never going to be able to achieve, given how bunkered those facilities were and given the fact that Iran apparently had moved a lot of the uranium offsite already.
And some of the reason you could theorize is because Donald Trump kept warning them that he telegraphed this. I mean, it all feels so circular. And I wonder where you go. You're on the Foreign Relations Committee. I mean, where do you go for facts? Who do you trust today?
Well, as you mentioned, they've also announced that they're going to stop sharing intelligence with Congress because they like it when they don't get caught in their lies. They like it better when they can just make up things and there's no way that they can be caught. And if they don't share information with Congress, then, yeah, there's a much higher likelihood that they're going to just tell the American people fabrications about the risks posed to us or to the success of missions that they undergo overseas, and no one will be the wiser. I guess where do I go from here, Nicole? They are also this week trying to take health care away from 16 million Americans. And there is an element of this version of his reality show that is designed to try to distract Americans from the fact that they are about to pass the most massive transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the rich in the history of the country. So I'm going to keep talking about what they have done to try to get away with a really criminal lie about this mission in Iran. But I'm also going to make sure that we don't let them turn the story from what will ultimately matter most to the people I represent, which is a bill that's going to destroy health care for 16 million Americans if they pass it this weekend.
Two top DOJ officials, who are also former Trump defense attorneys, grilled under oath by lawmakers on Capitol Hill today. This is a big story in any era because you have top people under oath. It's a bigger story right now because, according to whistleblowers and critics, the DOJ under Trump is already facing Watergate-level scandals. Attorney General Pam Bondi, well known, at a Senate budget hearing. And then an individual who has become increasingly controversial, including after that FU whistleblower complaint that came out yesterday, Emil Bovee, we'll get into that, faced a nomination hearing because Trump is trying to promote his former criminal defense attorney here to become a powerful appeals court judge who would oversee and rule on what Trump does. This comes on the heels of that whistleblower complaint that a Justice Department leader, this very person up for the nomination here, being grilled today, was, as the Times put it, blatantly suggesting the DOJ do the opposite of its entire government role, that it violate court orders, or, as the individual put it, that it say F you to the courts. Indeed, the whistleblower, who is a very experienced long-term official who, it bears mentioning as I leave this quote on the screen for you, is someone who served in the entire first Trump administration, defending all sorts of Trump policies, including the so-called Muslim ban or Middle Eastern ban. But this person, an insider, says they broke the rules and crossed the line when Bove stated that the DOJ would need to consider telling the courts this year, quote, F you, ignoring any orders. Now, let's take that in. F you to the courts. F you to the judges. F you to our entire constitutional system. This dropped like a bombshell yesterday. You could see that in the New York Times. You could see it across our air. You could see it. It was Lawrence O'Donnell's lead story. It was our lead story because it is a huge deal. Now, this individual is credible and is putting this forward in writing at great risk, and they're doing it through the whistleblower process, which you might remember from the Trump impeachment or all the way back to Vietnam scandals. Whistleblowers have certain legal protections, but they also face great risk. This individual, Mr. Reveni, put this all in writing with emails contemporaneous over 25 pages. It's an allegation. There were witnesses, he says, in the room, others who could corroborate this or not. And now this story is actually hitting Washington because some rules still matter, because nominees still have to go through a Senate vetting, because even the minority party, in this case the Senate Democrats, get time to put an individual under oath. And today we want to report, while this is a big allegation, this judicial nominee, this former Trump defense attorney, denies it under oath.
Senator, I have no recollection of saying anything of that kind. Well, I've certainly said things encouraging litigators at the department to fight hard for valid positions that we have to take. I have never advised a Department of Justice attorney to violate a court order.
The timing of it I find suspect. His hearing happens to be today, and I find the irony of the timing of it pretty remarkable. I also know my Deputy Attorney General, was in the room and said did not happen.
Those are the denials. And while we can get to the veracity of this, and we report the sourcing, we report when people deny things, and viewers, readers, citizens, you make up your own mind ultimately based on what you hear. But let's be clear. Everyone can see this is bad. This is a scandal. This isn't some situation where Donald Trump or his aides say, yeah, so what, we can do what we want. Pam Bondi was trying to lower the temperature on something that would be a scandal for her. Indeed, she even showed up at Bove's hearing after her own, a type of solidarity with an individual who stands accused of the worst thing you could be accused of at the DOJ, which is trying to blow up our system of law and order of justice and courts. Now, the New York Times reports the whistleblower complaint continues to highlight tensions that have been roiling the Trump Justice Department for months, with these more nonpartisan career lawyers fearing that the department's political leaders chosen by Trump are systematically undermining integrity. Bove was asked about this today, again under oath, and rejected these allegations that what he is doing, including allegedly going way over the line of what you're supposed to follow in court orders. The whistleblower complaint has other details as well about allegedly misdirecting or actively deceiving the courts about some of those flights that took off in a case they ultimately lost, lost the key round, about the return of that individual, Garcia. All of that is the context. This isn't exactly a strong suit for the administration, and he is defending and rejecting the idea that he does it all for Trump.
There is a wildly inaccurate caricature of me in the mainstream media. I am not anybody's henchman. I'm not an enforcer. I'm a lawyer from a small town who never expected to be in an arena like this.
Small town lawyer, maybe even a country lawyer, as the saying goes. You'll notice this old trope of going after the press or the messenger. Let's be very clear. While there has been press coverage scrutinizing all this, and that's common if you think back to other administrations, the DOJ is one of those agencies that gets covered a lot more than, say, agriculture. But the press covering the facts is not a press thing. The press covering what someone who served through the entire first Trump term defending those policies is not a press thing. The whistleblower defended the so-called Muslim or Middle East ban. The other accounts are coming from inside the government. The people who resigned over the alleged misconduct in a deal struck with the New York mayor, allegedly Trump officials had the whistle blown on that case, those were longtime conservative lawyers. So, while the nominee is free to testify and give his views, he can't accurately say this is some press thing. The problem is coming from inside the DOJ, from some pretty credible accounts of what's been happening. Then there was a question about asking about foreign interests in Donald Trump's very controversial, self-enriching meme coin and cryptocurrency.
It is wildly offensive that you would accuse President Trump of not protecting American interest in our country. You're trying to play a gotcha question with the President of the United States, and it's not going to work.
So it was a contentious day. Senator Booker also discussed these issues, addressing his colleagues, and warned about what it would mean, given what is known. Remember, there are plenty of qualified lawyers who don't get to be top federal judges, who rule on matters of life and death, of capital punishment, of war and peace. It's fine to say that someone did political work or other types of work and that maybe they're not going to be a perfectly independent, impartial judge, which is what the vetting is for, in addition to their professional acumen. Well, Senator Booker said to elevate this man, given what's already known, think about what that means, a lifetime appointment like this.
There is no scenario under which the White House counsel could believe that this nomination would be acceptable. Moreover, Mr. Beauvais's record makes clear that he has no business serving a lifetime on the federal bench.
We're joined by a former federal prosecutor who's also been counselor to exactly the kind of congressional committees we just saw there, John Flannery, and New York Times Magazine staff writer Emily Bazelon. Emily, I hope Mr. Beauvais wasn't talking about your publication or our outlet, mouthful. But he seemed to want to distract away from the core issue that is relevant and substantive in his hearing, which is whether he has the requisite independence and what the people who've worked most closely with him most recently say about whether he is an honest protector of the rule of law or not. I'm curious how you see it.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think the question here is who to believe about what happened behind the scenes. This whistleblower report is, you know, an astonishing account of these insider moments, and it's coming from someone who was a longtime career lawyer in the Department of Justice. That means he's not a political appointee. He takes pains to explain that he had implemented the policies of former presidents and of this president. He had actually just been promoted for his work on immigration enforcement. And so he is claiming to come from this perspective where he's defending the rule of law and all of the norms of the Justice Department that say that the government follows court orders. The government tells the truth in court. And so that's his stance here. And of course, then we have this denial from Emile Beauvais, and it's up to you who to believe. They have very different accounts, but the account is coming from inside the House. It is not something that the press spun up on its own.
John?
Well, Emily has, in the past, concentrated on bullies, and this is just an example of the lieutenants of Trump doing that, because this whole incident comes from our boy who wants to go on the Third Circuit, telling people this is what they have to do. He calls it encouraging, but he uses the F-bomb, tells them they'll lose their jobs and so forth. The exchange with Schiff was particularly useful because he did, that is, Beauvais did this interesting thing about I don't recall, which is a tell for most of us that we should examine, was that a real failure of recollection? He failed to recall that there was the F-bomb. But Schiff, who has experience as a questioner, former prosecutor, he zeroed in and pushed away the things that Beauvais tried to distract him from. And one of the best ones was the meeting. One of the meetings occurs on March the 14th. On March the 14th, that's when Beauvais says those planes have got to go and it's going to happen, and a whole variety of other things. Then the next day, March the 15th, the judge asks one of the representatives from the Department of Justice are these planes going are there anybody getting on planes going away? Not that I know of. It was a lie. And the significance of that is when he was asked that by Schiff, he says, I don't know when the dates were. I don't think there was an order at the time. And to show how precisely Beauvais was thinking, remember that the explanation for not violating the order was that they could have gotten the 100 Venezuelans off the plane in El Salvador before the judge's order was posted. Talk about Philadelphia lawyering. This deception will be shown to be, I think, rampant when they look at the emails and talk to the other witnesses and so forth. If the Republicans stand by him, then the cancer that has affected our government is owned by the Republicans.
Joining me now for his first national interview since yesterday's election in New York City is Zohran Mamdani. It's great to see you. I don't know if you've slept, and I'm sure you are still processing what happened last night. A lot of people on our team stayed up and watched your speech. I just laid out how I think you garnered as much support as you did. As you've processed this, what did I miss?
I think you covered quite a bit of how we got to this point, and I think the only thing I would really add is this volunteer team that we've built of now more than 50,000 people, they are the New Yorkers for whom democracy had started to lose meaning. It started to lose its relevance to the struggles of everyday New Yorkers. And they are the ones who for so long had not seen themselves in our local politics. And yet they are also the ones who brought us to this point, who knocked on more than 1.5 million doors across the 5 boroughs and showcased that a vision for a New York City, currently the most expensive city in the United States, a vision that would make it affordable, is one that speaks not only to progressives, but speaks to New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs, from Harlem to Bay Ridge, and speaks to the very fact that ultimately what city government's job is to make this city that much easier to live in and actually achieve the very dreams that brought you here in the first place.
As I'm sure you know, you probably haven't consumed all of it, I suppose, but there's been a lot of analysis, a ton, on what your success last night and in the last couple of weeks means nationally for the Democratic Party. Unquestionably, it means something about how people campaign, but what do you think it means?
I think it is part of a larger referendum on where our party goes. And I think one of the hopes that we had from the very beginning of this campaign was to move our political instinct from lecturing to listening. You know, at the national level, after the presidential election, we saw that New York was actually the state with the largest swing in the country towards Donald Trump, 11.5 points, and that swing took place far from the caricature of Trump voters, instead taking place in the hearts of immigrant New York City. And I went to those neighborhoods. I went to Fordham Road in the Bronx and Hillside Avenue in Queens, and I asked those New Yorkers, the vast majority of whom were Democrats, why they voted for Trump and what it would take to bring them back to the Democratic Party. And again, what I heard from them was cost of living, was an inability to afford the very things they recalled being able to purchase 4 years ago. And when they told me what it would take, they said again and again a relentless focus on an economic agenda. And ultimately, in listening to them, we built a campaign that was explicitly about making this city affordable. And I think too often in politics, there's a desire to impose what you think the debate is upon the people that you're seeking to represent, as opposed to listening to the very issues that are making it difficult for them to keep calling the city that they love the city that they live in.
I mean, you're running on issues that are very relevant to people in New York City, the cost of housing, free busing. Some have projected, that this is the type of platform that would work in other parts of the country. I mean, you're a proud democratic socialist. Do you think that is a platform that would work for other candidates running in other parts of the country?
Absolutely. I think ultimately this is a campaign about inequality. And you don't have to live in the most expensive city in the country to have experienced that inequality, because it's a national issue. And what Americans coast to coast are looking for are people who will fight for them, not just believe in the things that resonate with their lives, but actually fight and deliver on those very things. And part of how we got to this point was through the endorsements of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders, who've been leading this fight against oligarchy across the country. And I think that in focusing on working people and their struggles, we also return back to what makes so many of us proud to be Democrats in the first place.
Let's talk a little bit about the path forward here, because you still have to win a general election, and that is going to be hard fought, which I know you know. You were on track to defeat Andrew Cuomo. He called you to concede. Afterwards, a couple of times, he seems to have floated this potential plan or consideration of running as an independent. Are you preparing for him to run as an independent in the general election, or do you think it's possible he could drop out entirely before next Tuesday?
I think that everything is possible in this race, as we've seen over many, many months. And ultimately, we are prepared for taking on whomever our opponents may be in November. Because when I started this race, I started it running against Eric Adams' second term, running to finally have a city government that sought to resolve the affordability crisis, not exacerbate it. And when Eric Adams dropped out of the Democratic primary, it was Andrew Cuomo that picked up the mantle of that second term. The same donors, the same corruption, the same small vision funded by big money. And we have now defeated that vision in this primary, and I'm prepared to defeat that vision in the general, no matter who it is that's carrying it.
If Andrew Cuomo drops out, he had a lot of big money backers. Do you think they're going to big money back Eric Adams? Is that what you're preparing for?
I think that it's possible. I also think that we have found exactly the way to defeat organized money, which is organized people. We're speaking about a scale of a campaign that we haven't seen in the city in a long time. And ultimately, we believe in a politics of no translation, one that is both direct to the struggles of working people's lives and also delivered directly. And there is nothing more direct than a New Yorker knocking on another New Yorker's door. And that has been such a key part of this campaign's ability to break through more than $30 million in opposition spending, where New Yorkers were blanketed with attack ads, whether it be when they were turning on their television, their radio, opening their mailbox, or even just watching YouTube, and we were still able to triumph over that.
Both Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, obviously two Democratic leaders that have had some, I guess, nice things to say, I could describe them as, about you, but didn't endorse you and still haven't endorsed you almost 24 hours after Andrew Cuomo called you to concede. Why do you think that is?
Well, I appreciated both of their remarks, both their acknowledging of the focus of this campaign on affordability, and also with Senator Schumer having worked with him closely to deliver close to $500 million in debt relief for thousands of working-class taxi drivers, as well as successfully defeat a proposal to build a frack gas power plant in my district of Astoria in western Queens. And I think what we are seeing in this moment is an understanding of the mandate that New Yorkers have given us to deliver on this affordability, and also the fact that we will wait a few more days to see the actual final results of this, although we know that we have won this race even without the assistance of ranked choice voting.
Do you, I don't think endorsements win elections necessarily, but there's not a lot of proof of that in history, but do you want their support, or do you not care if they come out and forcibly endorse you?
I want their support, and I want the support of any leader across this city and this state and this country, because ultimately what we are looking to show New Yorkers is the fact that this is an ever-expanding coalition. It's not one that is trying to keep tabs of when people join this fight. It's one that's looking to actually deliver on this fight. And what that means is ensuring we use every single tool at our disposal to freeze the rent, to make buses fast and free, and to deliver universal child care.
Senator Bernie Sanders is an independent in Vermont. He endorsed Zohran Mamdani for mayor. In a new op-ed for The Guardian, he asked, quote, will the Democrats learn from Zohran Mamdani's victory? And he joins me now. Senator, what's your reaction to the big upset last night?
Enthusiastic. It was one of the great political victories in modern history. Zohran ran a brilliant campaign. And I think the most significant part of his campaign, and I, Chris, would not compare it to Obama or to Clinton. What Zohran understood is that in order to win, you got to be more than charismatic, and he is. You got to be more than smart, which he is. You got to build a strong grassroots movement around a progressive agenda. He had thousands and thousands of people knocking on doors because they were excited about his message. And his message said, you know what? In a time of unprecedented income and wealth inequality, we are going to ask the richest people in New York City to start paying their fair share of taxes. So among other things, we can address the major crisis facing New York and America, by the way, is soaring housing costs. They're going to freeze rent at a time when families can't afford decent quality food. He's talking about helping to create publicly funded grocery stores so that kids can get food that's affordable, making buses free. He's giving people a positive agenda, not just going after Trump, but giving something that people can believe in, an analysis which reflects their reality. So I thought it was a great campaign, and I look forward to continue to work with him.
You know, one thing I think is that I'm curious what you think of this theory. I think one thing that happens in campaigns is people get risk averse the more sort of backing they have, and so they don't want to screw it up. And the more that you're coming from a position of like, no one expects you to win, it does also give you latitude to actually go out and try stuff. Like, even whether that's a new ideas, like we're going to try publicly funded grocery stores. Like, no one else is saying that. But I do think there's an appetite for risk or trying new things that was so palpable in this campaign that seems to me also really important.
But it's not just, he sat up at night, I think, this is, a risky idea, but we'll do it.
No, right.
I think he is prepared, and this is the point. Look, what is the Democratic Party today, Chris? It is, I don't think people can argue with us. It is funded by very wealthy people. It is run by inside the Beltway consultants who really have very little clue about what's going on in the real world. And that is why I think, sadly, Kamala Harris lost an election that she should have won. It is a party which is not going to take on powerful special interests because of fundraising fears. And it certainly has turned its back on working people. And Zoran did all of that. He changed all of that about. And the question is, will the Democratic leadership learn from his campaign? I doubt it. I think they would rather go down with the Titanic than give up the fact that they are captains of the boat. But it doesn't really matter what they think. What Zoran's campaign showed is that people are prepared to stand up and fight for change. We're seeing that in the Fighting Oligarchy Tour. We saw it last week. Millions of people came out to the No King rally. People understand that our political and economic system is broken, that the rich get richer and millions of people are struggling to put food on the table. They understand the two parties today are not responding to their needs. They want something different. And I think Zoran touched on that reality.
I think some people may know this part of your bio, but some may not, which is that you were a congressman for Vermont, the at-large. There's one district. You are obviously a U.S. senator. Before that, you were a mayor in Burlington. And I'm curious, you were a socialist mayor. There's not a ton of them. We don't have a really long list of socialist mayors in America. So from one former socialist mayor to a man who may be a socialist mayor, one of the things I think about that job, whatever size municipality you're governing is, you really got to deliver for people. Like, you're not taking votes, right? So people are going to see very tangibly, like, is this working or not? And I'm curious how you think about what advice you would offer from that perspective, which is very different than being a senator or legislator.
Well, I just spoke to Zoran a little while ago, and I had some thoughts about it's going to be a very hard job. I mean, running any big city in America today with all of the crises that municipalities are facing is just not easy. And he's going to have to think long and hard about how you can run that city in a way that really works well for working people. But what I did as mayor of Burlington, and I was reelected 3 times, taking on Democrats and Republicans, is we focused on the basic issues. I kept property taxes as low as I could. I was conscious of the fact a lot of people can't afford higher taxes. We paved the streets, the sidewalks. We paid attention to working class and low-income areas that had been ignored for years. We started an after-school program. We started a child care program. We started a teen center for kids, which people still remember. We built affordable housing, started new ideas, community land trust for housing, which is now being done literally all over the world. It was started in Burlington, Vermont. So your point is we also spoke out on national issues, and we had a foreign policy. People joke, Burlington had a foreign policy. We could do it, but you can't do that unless you are paying attention to the day-to-day needs of working class people. So I remember one guy wrote, somebody said, your mayor is a socialist. What do you think about that? The guy says, I really don't know, but he is getting the streets paved.
Yes, that's exactly. It all starts from there at every level of politics. Senator Bernie Sanders.
Joining us now, founder and CEO of Independent Veterans of America, Paul Rieckhoff, who is host of the Independent Americans podcast. Let me play an exchange, actually, that President Trump had when he was questioned by a Ukrainian reporter.
So my question to you is whether or not the U.S. is ready to sell anti-air missile systems Patriot to Ukraine. We know that Russia has been pounding Ukraine really heavily right now.
Are you living yourself now in Ukraine?
My husband is there.
Wow.
And
I can see you very, it's amazing.
And me with the kids, I'm in Warsaw, actually.
They do want to have the missiles, okay, as they call them. The Patriots, and we're going to see if we can make some available. They're very hard to get. We need them too. We were supplying them to Israel, and they're very effective.
Paul, that was a really interesting exchange, but I wonder, with so much attention going to the situation with Iran, if you think it's more or less likely that Zelensky is going to get the help he needs.
I think it's more likely. I think Trump wants a win. And I think he's changed his tone. That's a major change in tone from when he was yelling at Zelensky in the White House, right? And I think Trump's tone has been slowly changing, in part because he's a populist, and I think he's coming around to the fact that Ukraine is popular around the world, and especially here in America. Veterans like myself especially have been really making the case for Ukraine for a long period of time. The minerals deal was a big step forward, and now he's got a bipartisan Senate sanctions bill coming from Lindsey Graham that I think will drop in the next couple of weeks. It's going to produce added pressure. So he's moving in the right direction. He's still Trump, and he's still unpredictable. But I think if you're Zelensky, this is much better than where you were a couple of months ago.
So what would you make of a conversation now that he would have with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I hope he will put Putin on the defense. I hope he will stand with Ukraine and make it clear that Putin is the bad guy and Ukraine is the good guy. For too often, he was normalizing Putin. He was acting like he was somebody.
He does seem a little frustrated with him.
He does. And if that gets us to a better place for Ukraine, I think we should take it. Because Ukraine is still deep in the fight. The Russians still have 20,000 Ukrainian children. They're still bombing and being killed every day. I think the challenge is not to get distracted by other things. Obviously, we have to keep focused on Iran and our domestic security, but Ukraine continues to fight on bravely. And I think this is the fight of our time. And it's also in our national security interest to continue to degrade the Russian military. Ronald Reagan would have been thrilled if you said, you know what, we can take out tons of Russian forces without losing an American life. That would be a good deal for most Republicans, and if Trump gets there, later, we'll have to take it.
So today's NATO declaration, however, is also the first one that does not directly condemn Russia's aggression in this war against Ukraine. Are there concerns both that the U.S. and NATO nations could be, at least rhetorically, peeling back, and there could be consequences of that?
Yeah, they shouldn't be. I mean, now's the time to put the pedal down and to increase the pressure on Russia in every single way. And I think there's another piece here. I have long advocated for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO. I think they should have been admitted already. There is no more seasoned, no more tested, no more experienced fighting force on the planet than Ukraine right now. We need an ally like Ukraine in NATO. And the longer we wait, I think the longer we are at a strategic disadvantage in America and across NATO. So I hope this will add momentum to that discussion, too. And we see a day soon where Ukraine is formally a part of NATO.
I'm literally out of time, but I have to ask you about the comparison the president made to the bombs that were dropped in Iran to Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I mean, he's just consistently out of touch, especially on military and defense issues, and he's too loose with his tongue, and too often he's deciding foreign policy by Twitter and X, and he needs to stop doing it because it's bad for America and bad for everybody.
Paul Rieckhoff, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Your kids are out of school at the end of today.
One more day. One more day.
Have a great summer.
Thank you. You too.
All right, let's keep talking about immigration and Donald Trump. So, Matthew, you were saying that there were some swing voters who didn't, I guess, are surprised at what they're seeing with the mass deportation now. Donald Trump ran on it. Jacob was there. I was at the convention as well. This mass deportation now, we're going to do it. We're going to do Operation, we're not going to say the word. We're going to get 10 million immigrants out of this country, 1 million of them undocumented out of this country immediately. I'm wondering what you thought Republican voters or swing voters anticipated they would see. And is this because, I mean, what was Donald Trump telling them something, telling them a story about immigrants in this country that they are now surprised doesn't line up with the experience of who's actually being detained?
Well, I mean, I hate to hesitate to get into the emotional or psychic nature of a Trump voter and what they thought they were hearing and what they actually thought was going to happen with Donald Trump. Donald Trump talked about this issue, but he talked about many other things, not the least of which was going after Joe Biden because he was incapable of being president and inflation being out of control and worries about the economy. What I was saying is there's a difference between what the base thought he was going to do, and I would guess that some of the base didn't think he was going to do this. They thought he was going to have some orderly way that he was going to get people and process them, move them. The swing voters who decided Pennsylvania, who decided Michigan, who decided Wisconsin, who decided North Carolina, who decided Georgia, didn't have immigration in their top three issue. The top issue they had of why they made the decision for their vote was inflation. The second one was the economy. The third one was health care. That's why those voters, now they heard Donald Trump say a lot of stuff, and as he does often in campaigns and he does often at the White House, but what they focused on was what was the concern to them. And as they see this unfold, in combination with the fact that Donald Trump has done nothing about the economy and has done nothing about inflation, and they watch this unfold, I think many of them are aghast at what they thought was going to be his priority and why they voted for him and what he is actually doing.
I wonder, though, if they also thought that the immigrants in this country, the undocumented immigrants, were largely criminals. I mean, Donald Trump, when he campaigned, he would bring out families who had been affected by undocumented immigrants, either violently killed or accidentally killed, these mothers who were grieving. And so I wonder if the image that a lot of voters got was that these undocumented immigrants are all criminals.
Yeah.
They've come across the border. They're rapists. They're drug dealers. Some are good people.
I think Trump voters certainly thought that he would be prioritizing undocumented individuals who had committed crimes and were still living in the United States. I want to make another point. Just as like a student of history, I'm recalling how during the civil rights era, Southern blacks gained the support of white Northerners once those white Northerners started seeing images on television of the way that they were treated by law enforcement officials and segregationists. And I think that's an analog, that's a parallel to what's happening now. I mean, people generally agree with the idea that if you're here illegally and you're committing crimes or you otherwise pose a danger to the public, you should be the first to go. But what we're seeing from this administration is the deportation illegally of citizens and other people who may well, through legal process, be allowed to go, but who are not getting the due process that people are entitled to under our
Or they're just members of the community that they didn't think would be a priority. Like there was a story in the Washington Post about Carol, who was an Asian immigrant who had been here for a long time, worked a number of jobs in the community, was a mother, and she was detained. Right. And they would say, why Carol? What did Carol do other than try to contribute to this community? But I want to ask about the Democrats. We talk about this.
Do we have to?
No, the shocking images that we're seeing for Donald Trump's immigration policy, the way he's treating it. Are Democrats offering an alternative for voters who do prioritize immigration? They want the immigration policy in this country to change. They want the border to remain shut. Are they offering an alternative to allow those voters to then vote for Democrats?
Let me be fair to the members of my party by drawing attention to the fact that Democrats had negotiated a bipartisan border security bill around this time last year that was torpedoed cynically after Donald Trump woke up one day and went to social media and said, don't do this thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and he wasn't even president at the time.
He wasn't president, but by then, people carried water for him within the Republican majorities in Congress. And so it's not that Democrats have not set forth an agenda that would enhance border security and all of the things associated with that, in addition to what we've already known over the past several decades, which is that Democrats also support a plausible pathway to citizenship.
But are they messaging on it? I mean, one thing we learned from Zoran is that he went out and he gave a positive message of what this city could look like. Yeah. Are Democrats coming out and giving a positive message for what immigration can look like in this country?
No,
Here's the way that we can use it. Here's the way that we can assimilate. We can bring people out of the shadows. Hey, also, we're going to deal with the border.
The most important thing for Democrats to do right now is talk about these Medicaid cuts that are about to go into effect.
So immigration should be a priority.
Immigration should continue to be a priority. But in terms of what people should be messaging right now, it should be mostly about the fact that millions of people in this country are about to lose health care, SNAP benefits, for low-income people, kids who are relying on this for food and other sustenance. I mean, that is what should be relentlessly messaged in the press.
I had Brendan Buck on just a moment ago talking about that very thing.